So welcome to the NCSA Colloquium series, and this is just to reemphasize, it's a really important event for us, so I'm glad to see a good crowd here. It's something we're trying to establish a culture of, so I really encourage you to come if possible every week and bring your friends and sort of advertise this. I think this is one of the central events for NCSA each week, for us to have a great speaker from the outside come and tell us about some exciting things. And there's probably no better speaker to do that than Brygg Ullmer. Brygg is a professor of computer science at Louisiana State University, and he's also one of the key members of an important center there, the Center for Computation and Technology, which is an interdisciplinary center that draws on the strengths of the entire campus and, in fact, across the state. And it's very much what I envision NCSA to be in terms of, as we develop our own relations with different departments on campus, will be a place that really mixes things, that builds on all the technologies we have. And so Brygg will be telling us in particular about some advanced technologies that he's been at the forefront of for many years. So in fact, Brygg has been an undergraduate and got his bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois back in the middle 90s. I forgot what year.
91 to 94.
91 to 94. And in fact, overlapped with some of us who were here, and in particular worked with Donna and others back at that time. And then he went off and did a number of interesting things. And in fact, Brygg and I apparently crossed paths when we were here just a little bit. But then we ran into each other in Berlin, where Brygg was working at the Konrad Zuse Institute when a number of us were at the Albert Einstein Institute. And I, having been trained at NCSA, was very interested in how scientific visualization and sort of novel ways of interacting with data and computing environments could be applied to our own needs of solving Einstein's equations, which are rather complicated as well. And so we had some projects there. And then we liked Brygg so much, we recruited him to LSU, where he became a professor and has gone on to develop an entire large and very, very dynamic research group at LSU that really touches many of the disciplines that are present at the CCT and beyond. So I'm looking forward to your talk. I'm sure it's going to be exciting, and thank you for coming, Brygg.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Ed, and a warm thanks again to Ed and Gab, to all of those I've met with in the past few days, and especially to all of you for the chance to speak with you here today. So I would like to talk about this topic, a few words you're familiar with, some maybe less so, of tangible visualization, and give you a sense what that has to do with interactive computational STEAM. As Ed mentioned, while I never had a formal affiliation in my years at Illinois, NCSA was a deeply formative part of my past then and now. The chance to, even in the first month here, get to know your Cray YMP, to hang out in Donna Cox's beautiful gardens of visual machines and virtual reality center, but especially to experience the really beautiful chemistry of faculty, staff, students, and those computational resources that you established then and now as well. And I think that even 23 years ago, the word that I heard most on the lips of people across Illinois, but especially here, was interdisciplinary. And seeing how those seeds planted then and long before have grown and blossomed so fruitfully is again, really a wonderful thing. It shaped my career, certainly. So as Ed mentioned, I'm at LSU jointly in EECS and computer science and the Center for Computation and Technology. And I do have two hats there. On the one side, there are 5 different research areas, focus areas that Ed and Gab established. One of them is called cultural computing, where we have 15 faculty, 3 from art, 3 from business technology, 3 from computer science, 3 from music, others from ICy, mass communications, and our new digital media arts and engineering program. I also work with something that Ed and Gab led also in earlier years, LBRIN, the Louisiana Biomedical Research Network, where we have 13 often principally undergraduate institutions, campuses around the state, and my job is to lead computational biology, bioinformatics, biostatistics activities there. So. But again, thank you for this opportunity. So giving a colloquium at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, I thought it was perhaps interesting to think about a dimension to supercomputing applications perhaps you've not thought so much about. So if each of you were to think of a favorite supercomputing application in the past, in the present, perhaps in the future, maybe looking at supercomputing applications very broadly of many different disciplines touched transformatively by at-scale computation, I'd like for you to think for a moment, what is the shape of that supercomputing application? Now, I suspect many of you first thought about virtual editions on the desktop, on the web, on a smartphone perhaps, But could you begin to imagine physical editions of those supercomputing applications? What might be the materials you would use? Wood and glass, steel, paper, cardboard? What might be the shape of that application? Is it bigger than a bread box, smaller than a station wagon? Do you wear it on your shoulder? Do you walk through it, inside, outside, different spaces? Again, where does that supercomputing application live in the world? Is it on your desk? Is it on your body? Is it in your living room? These are questions that I don't know if everyone thinks so much about today, but I hope over the course of the talk to give you some ideas of what that could mean and why that could be impactful, both to computational science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics, but with aspiration, surely, taught by Mosaic and so many other NCSE accomplishments of generalizing more broadly. So let me start with some concrete images to begin getting a sense for that. So here, as you can clearly see, is a picture of Google Spreadsheets, or Excel, as viewed in the last few days. Now, centuries back, they would call this a counting table, and this was just how you did business. If you wanted to buy real estate, a bunch of potatoes, we would have these tokens that represented the objects under discussion, and we would have a conversation or an argument or a dialogue between very different kinds of people. And as you look at this image and sort of cross your eyes towards the future, I think this is perhaps a schematic for one edition of a big data workbench. Yes? Where each object represents a terabyte, a petabyte, an exabyte of data, a computational resource for transforming or viewing that. Maybe that object represents a person or a group of people, or 1,000, 1,000,000, 1,billion people with their genomes that we're working with. I like this image. Let me give you another image of a possible physical edition for a supercomputing application. So if you've read parts of Watson's Double Helix, he talks about, in his words, the very transformative power that having physical representations, being able to, again, have great discussions around the data, made in their articulation insights to the structure of DNA. And so again, viewed through modern lenses, if we look at each of those physical artifacts or another variation and think of each one of those representing not a nucleotide, but a whole genome, or 1,000, 1,000,000, 1,billion different genomes, what might those have as possibilities, both for scientists, for students, for senators, for solicitors, for street people, all of the different members of humanity and beyond that are touched transformatively by computational genomics, the work of IGB, of NCSA now, and others. Let's go to another. Any hands? Any of you familiar with the Philips machine or the Moniac? Any of you? Wonderful. 2? Fantastic. So I learned about this midway through my graduate studies. I was showing to an economics professor in Japan I'd grown up with my work, and he said, you know, that was done in the 1940s at the London School of Economics. This was an object maybe 7 foot tall in scale, a series of red and blue fluids flowing through its pipes and elements, and by manipulating those valves, this was a functional representation of the macroeconomy of the British Empire, claimed to be accurate within 3 to 5%. And so I like to imagine in 2008, if we had had a more modern version, transformed or powered by NCSA resources, helping people of varying types, understanding these complex internal digestive processes of the world financial system. Would that have given a different perspective? Today, as we look to futures, varied and wide, is this, again, an image primarily of the past, or could it be an image of the future? Let me pick 2 images I believe are from NCSA, old friends of yours, the CM2, the CM5. Ed has talked about how the CM5 was transformative to his and colleagues' ability to do 3-dimensional astrophysics for the first time. So one of the gentlemen most responsible for these machines, a gentleman named Danny Hillis, I don't know how many of you are familiar with his undergraduate days at MIT, but he, working with a graduate student, Radia Perlman and others, built one of the first tangible interfaces, powered by digital computation, using a series of cards aimed at 5-year-olds to let those 5-year-olds express conditionals, recursion, all sorts of things that rather more advanced people sometimes struggle with. Then to control robotic and virtual turtles, the early versions of the Logo language. But as I hear people amongst you, students, talking about flocks of thousands or millions of drones and how to connect those in different sorts of ways, might again, these tools, whether it's for 5-year-olds or 25-year-olds or 75-year-olds, be the kinds of tools that might, even while giving us a subset of the functionality of our powerful graphical workstations, give us some important ways to think about shaping those kinds of activities. Many other examples. As you can tell, I love history. This was another thing we found in the hallway. We thought it was an X-Files project or something. But again, late 1980s at MIT, physically describing fluid dynamics, where they were imagining pouring hundreds or thousands of small computers the size of marbles into a structure to do, actually, the supercomputing. They started out with a rather smaller number. But let me get to my own work. So these are some images of my efforts over the last 20 years. Again, to begin to get ready to seriously ask and especially engage this question, how could we give physical form? Think about the physical editions complementing the virtual editions of your and others' supercomputing applications. You're seeing lots of different objects. You're seeing bits of graphics woven throughout. So you're seeing some genome activities, which I'll tell you about as well. But the structure for what I'd like to do is to spend some time, again, giving you a more applied sense of what we think of as tangible visualization, to talk about my activities the last 8 or 9 years together with my wife and others in different forms of computational STEAM, especially in computational genomics, and to explore some of the directions we're beginning to head with thinking about what would physical entanglement mean and how can we make those computational STEAM applications more interactive in different ways. So a lot of my background and my studies at the MIT Media Lab were situated in human-computer interaction initially. And I think one view that is easy to think about in the present, has been relevant for many years, is thinking about some major trajectories involving the online world, social media, other sorts of, yes?
Sorry, I'm not sure everyone will know what STEAM means, and I think it would be important for you to point out what the A is.
Very good. So everyone is familiar with STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. The A, while there's a minority who talks about it as applied mathematics, Donna and I know it stands for the arts. And there's a lot of, and not just any application of the arts, but I think nowhere better exemplared, in my highly biased opinion, by Donna's group, and showing how can that set of eyes that she and Bob and others have take data that otherwise might have stayed in large hard disks and give people a vision, an aspiration, give it legibility, give it actionability. That is some of, to me, the past, through mentorship here, of what STEAM has been, and trying to think about interactively, not just with the cooked data, but with the live data, some of the steering types of things that Ed and others, colleagues, have been working with for decades. How can we begin realizing that? But towards here, the online world, social media, cloud computing, so on and so forth, the physical world, now smartphones and wearables and even your old thermostats. You can think about those as somewhat separate ideas, but especially these days, wearing a computer scientist label, we like Venn diagrams. And here there's an intersection to be seen, and I would actually argue it's a much bigger intersection than I've shown conveniently there. And so what if we start really focusing on that intersection between the cloud, the web, and physicality? And specifically, let's begin breaking that up. We can think about different legacy forms. So I guess 20 years later, we can think about the web as sort of a somewhat well-understood online medium. But can we also think about new forms that could take? The sort of movement from the plastic wood veneer into the new shapes of what might a radio be? What might other sorts of externalizations of online activity be? And so my activity focuses very much at this intersection. What are the new specific possibilities for this intersection between physical and virtuality? But also there's no reason that should displace or replace or obsolete other sorts of ways. And so this idea of bridge forms, how do we connect those different mobile things that are so pervasive now with these new kinds of technologies that we're developing? And so when Professor Karahalios, Marigdis, and I all arrived at the Media Lab in 1995, there was this Things That Think consortium. I'd been working with colleagues at Interval Research who were also thinking, what would this intersection between bits and atoms mean? Is it about a coffee cup that can talk? Or is there something more that we can do with that? So these were a couple of my first projects as a master's and then PhD student, taking physical objects, letting those represent different cyber-physical associations. People, places, data, etc. Move those about and have that transformed by underlying 2D, overhanging 3D graphical representations. We did this a little too literally in some ways because a bug I always tried to get rid of with this system is if you took off those objects and you put your hands on this infrared backsense things, you could pinch and zoom the map and do all sorts of things that all of us use today. We stayed focused, though, and really thought about the tangibility, and we'll see where that sort of led us. Something that I've not done as much with until quite recently, we talked about how those kinds of hands-on, graspable interaction might be complemented with spatial architectural interactions. We built a system called the ambient room, where we use projectors and even light off rippling water to, on the ceilings, on the walls, on the floors, try to give some gestalt, some feel for activity out there in the world. And especially in a world that's just absolutely stewing with the online stuff, I look at these naked walls, and again, it gives me this great desire to look what you've been doing in many parts of this beautiful building. You, more than any other building I've experienced, have these extrusions from the walls trying to let the energies, the activities at the center begin escaping. And so my excitement, especially with some of the last work I'll show you today, is literally, or not literally, metaphorically, how can we light the walls on fire? If those walls could speak, what are they wanting to say? And think again about how there's an ecology, a symbiosis between these sort of background displays and the foreground displays, which will make more sense as we go along. Something else happened, though, as I began to make those objects. I was well prepared by my time at Illinois to do lots of fancy electronics, lots of fancy software, and so I did that with these first systems. It was a great chance to bring them together. But I did not leave my undergraduate days here with skills in machining. I'd never used a bandsaw. I really think it would be a beautiful thing if every person who graduates, at least from the College of Engineering, has used a bandsaw, has used a soldering iron, because that's something there's a kind of tacit knowing, and you can't learn it just by reading it in a book. And what I discovered more than those tools is I developed a really beautiful relationship with a laser cutter in particular. Some other tools, CNC mills, lathes, a little bit with a 3D printing. And that gave me two different perspectives on what tangible visualization might be. On the one side, we could think about using these tools, which are now so much in the press, the 3D printers, et cetera, to build physical tokens, physical objects to transform graphical visualizations, the scientific visualizations that you lead the world with. But could we also begin thinking about having the objects, as the early examples, some of them showed, begin to physically embody in some form, representationally embody some aspect, like that double helix of Watson and Crick, of the domain that they were studying? And then what is the kind of internal sensing and illumination, the projections? How can we think about maybe mechatronics to bring those objects to life? So here are a few examples at the bottom, then and later, of some systems that I built. I'll just mention very quickly. A couple of them on the left. This was a project done in a 70-story office tower, the Tokyo Opera City building in Tokyo. And we were coming up with a series of physical tokens to represent the water consumption, the energy consumption. We really wanted, my biggest interest there was the network traffic, but there were many fiercely competitive companies on adjacent floors, and so they wouldn't give me that information. But what you could begin seeing by sort of putting these tokens down on this spinning time is you could see things happening. You could see a concert about to begin in the National Opera by the energy ramping up on a hot summer day for the air conditioning. You could begin feeling those processes within this building. And especially then, here was one on the right. I was working with the computer security folks, thinking if you took those, well, in the day we were calling them Saint and Satan and Nmap and all of those different tools to understand security vulnerabilities, denial of service attacks. And there's this big challenge of trigger conditions. If you triggered on everything, you'd always be triggering. But if you don't trigger on something, you won't know when something really bad starts going down. And so could we again think about some general purpose elements that while we're doing other things, let us tailor the trigger conditions? And then some special purpose elements that were somehow representational of the building or some other aspects. I had a really painful moment in doing this work that this was a vision I was really involved with, but it's turned out to be rather harder to fully realize than I initially thought. You know, all of the electronics and firmware and protocol and product design and software design. And so my advisor said, for my PhD purposes, I had to choose between the physically representational and those special tokens. And so what I chose then wanted to be done in the biological sense, but my parents had said growing up to me, son, it would be really cool if we understood something about what you did when you grew up. And my dad was a real estate agent at that point in Charlotte, and so I did an application relating to real estate. I'll show that briefly to you now and tell you what that relates to with genomics and some current versions. I'll try to show that. Let's see, it worked a couple moments ago. Let's try that one more time. So here we have some physical tokens. At that point, each was embedded with an RFID tag, and each represented a parameter of a database. And so we can take something like price and plop it down out there, and we're going to see several complementary, very simple information visualizations, sort of a scatter plot view and a GIS, a geographical view. And so we're turning about some threshold again and seeing properties for more or less amount of money. Now we're throwing out acreage, and so we're able to look for a lot of land for not so much price, and again, see properties showing in the periphery, as you might expect with that. But maybe we were looking for clustering or trending of that data, and we're not really seeing it there when we sweep out in a moment so much. But if we grab another parameter of, I think it's square footage, we'll see that's rather more nicely shaped. Maybe we want to flip the axes. Well, let's just flip the axes, or if we want to add a third parameter, let's add a third parameter. These were continuous parameters. Let's think about different discrete parameters. So we could view patio homes here or mobile homes and see the different distributions. Or having those categories discretely, maybe we want to do a combination with some different continuous parameters. And again, a lot of the interest was how can we very quickly navigate some different sets of views, different content, not reproduce all of the controls that you would want to have on your GUI workstation. But starting with one person, and our real interest, the motivation for this was I wanted to work with biology. So my very first elective, my first semester here in the campus honors program, was hacking DNA, running it through gels, and I do a lot more of that these days computationally. And so I wanted to think, how would you have a biologist, a physicist, a sales manager, and a medical doctor having a great conversation around the data? And that's actually very much the work that we're beginning to do now. We also were looking at how could we start having physical tokens that we could dynamically bind to different kinds of information, that could show the histograms of the information embedded. Now, I had a very particular philosophy for how I wanted to fabricate these things, and it took a woman from Germany visiting, not my wife, to say, you've got a brick there, and it's not that comfortable to do the physical manipulations that you want. Today we have smartphones and other sorts of things, and so that's taken this into very different dimensions. Here you're seeing dynamically binding different parameters on a graphical screen. So there was an unofficial, but in some ways very accurate mantra at the Media Lab at that point called demo or die. And we were encouraged to very quickly and rapidly come up with new ideas, but maybe not to dive so very deeply into any particular one of them. And so when I had the chance to work with Ed and Gab in the project they co-led, Grid Lab, a grid computing project, I was a part of the visualization component, but somehow managed, partly through their support, one of those MPG bar grants that wasn't supposed to be a research grant, but I didn't understand that and tried to make it in anyhow. I thought, how could I begin taking those things held together with duct tape and chewing gum and start to think, how could I realize those to throw down a card and instead of doing all the grid proxy inits with Globus and this and that, to bring up some constellation of information. Here what you're seeing as a picture is not the numerical relativity that I was really supposed to be doing, but we had a brief but interesting liaison with a medical doctor who was in the business of breaking people's faces. That if it turned out that your jaw was rather severely twisted, he might, to readjust that, need to break your face in 6 or 7 or 8 different pieces. And people before their face was broken, and the doctors too for that matter, sort of like to have a vision what you would look like when they reassembled you. And so beautiful simulations of the soft tissue and other sorts of things, but the doctor's already never working less than 110 hours a week, and so he just doesn't have time to master any visualization package. And the thought again, can we abstract some of the key objects of interest, a patient, an operation, and try to make that very easy for him. And so going to LSU, as Ed mentioned, I was really inspired by how Ed had structured his group at AEI having a tools group and a science group and trying to create the right mixtures between. And so I've tried, with varying successes along the way, to have more of an architecture and a tool side, and then an application side, where we were applying those especially to computational STEAM applications, initially especially to scientific visualization, and you'll see how that's evolved in practice to more computational genomics for many reasons. There also has been community building, so this grew, this idea of tangible interfaces from a few people at a few places to a conference that we first hosted as the Mardi Gras Conference, but also affiliated with ACM. We first had 120 or so folks show up in Baton Rouge, but we're now approaching the 10th year of this conference. I think earlier this year it was in Germany with about 400 people attending. It'll be hosted by Stanford in January, and I'm a conference co-chair in Eindhoven for the 10th anniversary. We began trying to, I don't know, Ed, if you ever really formalized it, but I thought I heard you say going beyond proof of concept, which was quite different than sort of demo or die. And so we began thinking, again, not with the one person that you saw with the original parameter wheels, but with several people in one room, maybe several people in different rooms, linked by AG at that point, other sorts of technologies. Again, working towards this idea of having a good conversation, discussion, and argument, not around the dead PowerPoint, but around the live data, somehow manipulated by these physical tools. We spend a lot of time engineering, too much time, the digestives of that, trying to compose, decompose these devices out of these series as sort of an internet of small little modules, some that would be doing sort of force feedback, some that would be doing the RFID. The reason for that was wanting to build things, you'll see a version of this on Ed's desk 2 days ago at least, bigger, again, physical descriptions of the Lonnie infrastructure in Louisiana, and that might need hundreds of these little elements. And we do it badly the first time, so could we take out those elements, and rather than landfilling everything, could we reassemble them? So I'll show you later how that's come to more frequent or current relevance. We've explored many different, more than a dozen different physical embodiments of these in a lot of different domains. While we started working purely with the scientists, we've done a number of projects in the K-12 STEM space. So I think, I'm trying to remember if it was Maxine Brown or someone else, but there was an opportunity to have a couple kids in Baton Rouge and a couple kids in North Carolina, not Maxine, it was playing with a Hurricane Katrina visualization over a dedicated gigabit, dedicated Lambda. Gabrielle Allen led a project in Beijing with, so here you're seeing my student, Cornelius Toole, with our tangibles controlling, was it Ranger or one of the machines at attack at that point. And they won internationally across amazing competition. Or here, another project where some students, while Deepwater Horizon, the oil spill was unfurling, thinking, how could we take a completely passive object, set it on an early Microsoft Surface, let that be illuminated and do parameter studies. And then this was also our first project where we took an iPad and started saying, can we replace all of those really interesting but not so easy to reproduce electronics and take those to mass consumer devices and go somewhere with that. Here's a much more recent version, and we've tried to make a lot of innovations in the platform while keeping initially the real estate content, but this time viewed through D3 and Google Maps and other things. But then here, you're seeing these tokens now are using these mass market little Siftio cubes with little displays in them, or even looking as right now at how smartwatches can act as those kinds of tokens nicely with gyroscopes and other elements that would sense, and place those on tablets and, again, have several different people initially in one room, but very much excited about how does that scale up? How would you use that in a class? How would you use that in a MOOC where you have a large number of people and you want to think about, again, how do you have a conversation across 100 different campuses and people all over the place? Thinking also, there's Brian Bailey and some folks here in computer science doing really interesting work relating to attention, which is something that we are all progressively starved of. And so one of the ways of communicating, when you pick up an object here, the accelerometer that's built in will report back and go ahead and highlight that parameter and slightly animate it, even though you've not manipulated it yet, to say to someone, this person is gesturing, they're thinking about that. Sort of like with the tile rack, we divide on Scrabble. There's the epistemic interaction. When you're moving things behind the tile rack, no one else sees what you're doing, but they're really helpful for you to think about that data. And then the pragmatic interaction, when you actually pick up that tile and play it on the board, we're trying to sort of operationalize that by animating out, especially towards having larger numbers of people, where I can't see what Ed is doing or what Gab are doing or what Donna's doing, but can we mediate that in some fashion? And especially, do I have it in the next slide? No, a couple slides. How we're trying to present that now in a genomics context, but I think that's in a couple of slides. The current NSF grant that I've been focusing most actively on, I lead a grant for an interactive computational cluster. So I think still it's the case, as it was 50 years ago, that most big clusters focus on batch type interactions. And so our interest here is if we sort of flip that idea, and maybe we'll backfill with batch when people aren't interacting, but how can we prioritize interactivity? Maybe that's on a dedicated cluster, or maybe with a machine even like Blue Waters, do we want to take 5% or some percent and have that really be interaction-oriented? And we've taken a dual-pronged approach. One approach is looking at tools like MATLAB, Mathematica, Visits, that already have parallelization mechanisms. And I think that's actually being done on Blue Waters, I learned in the last couple days. But also, how can we begin to, with special interaction programming languages, other sorts of things, write applications that are always intended to be seen by many different eyes, backed by many different cores. And again, you'll get a flavor for that in just a couple moments, well, in the next slides as I go into genomics. So let me pivot now for a much smaller number of slides relating to computational STEAM, and especially the computational genomics. I think probably at least half of you, hopefully more than that, have already seen this rather well-known image from NHGRI comparing Moore's law and all of the astounding, what is it, doubling every 18 months, a factor of 100 every decade or so. And here on the semi-log, that white line is Moore's law. And what you're seeing there with the green dots is the cost per base pair of sequencing. So roughly 15 years ago, to sequence a genome was maybe a couple $1 billion. Now it's a couple $1,000. 6 orders of magnitude between over 15 years is really not bad. And this other line here doesn't appear to be slowing down. And so that has huge implications for all of the computational sciences, how to manage those tens of petabytes of information. Also, sociological issues as well. And so let me go a little bit into that. If the planes are willing, at 8 in the morning tomorrow, I'll be in a genetics education workshop in San Diego, and hopefully we'll be talking a little bit about implications of this figure. So if we think about your genome, each one in the room, my naive assumption, even maybe as a graduate of a class related to this at Illinois, is maybe most of our genome codes for flesh and blood. Well, there's a lot of debate, and this is evolving much more rapidly, the understanding than I would have expected, but maybe one conventional wisdom is maybe it's only 1.6% of your genome actually codes for protein. And about half of your genome is what we call mobile elements. They may be a few hundred, a few thousand letters long, and some of them once moved, and some of them still move about in your genome. One of my favorite elements is something called ALU. Every one of you has roughly 1 million copies of this thing that's about 300 base pairs long. But by nucleotide count, there's 10 times as much of just that one ALU element as all your protein coding genes. And 1 in 20 of us, so maybe 4 people in this room, let's say, have a new mutation that neither of your parents had. And there's speculation that a much larger number of individuals that were never born had this issue, but the random mutation was significantly problematic. The embryo never became viable. And so there's a lot of study about these, both for pragmatic reasons as markers to be able to compare across human populations. A lot of our work is relating to the fact that across different primates, this balance is altogether similar, though we'll show some important differences. But my wife, who was working as a medical doctor in Berlin, when she came to Louisiana, it was hard to do the sort of university medical research in Baton Rouge, and if we had moved to New Orleans, as we were considering, that would have been 5-6 months before Katrina, which would have been problematic as well. And so she spent a lot of time, first as a postdoc, now as a research professor, focusing on mobile elements meet the intersection of wet bench and computational genomics. And about a year after she got there, one of her colleagues or advisors said, "We've got a great opportunity. If we can just come up with a small result in the next 2 weeks, we can get a chance to be a part of a really big, important project involving rhesus, which is an important biomedical organism, HIV research, et cetera." And she and I started doing the calculation, first benchmarking, and we discovered on that single-core 800 megahertz machine that she had, it would only take 2 or 3 decades to get the result that we needed in 2 weeks. And so all of that sort of standing around big machines here at CCT suddenly became very, very pragmatic, where we could begin taking a few hundred cores and then in a few weeks coming up with that result much more quickly. Let me show you a couple of the different kinds of results very generally. So with the rhesus, we were comparing rhesus with chimpanzee and human. Because it turns out when you had the first human genome project, it doesn't really buy you that much. It's only through comparing more similar and less similar organizations that you really can begin organisms, teasing out and understanding the structure. So we got through that, a whole lot of 130-hour weeks or whatever, but had a nice publication in Science. I thought I sort of understand this, and so we started working on the orang genome. Rhesus are very numerous. Some of the orangs are very threatened, but alu that I told you about, there was every reason to believe that just as it was in human, chimpanzees, and rhesus, the number of sort of organism-specific alus, the new alus, might be similar with orangs as with the other. But I couldn't find them. Miriam couldn't find them, almost any of them. And we're realizing, okay, maybe we don't really understand this very well. Let's go to some of the world experts in Seattle. They couldn't find them. And so suddenly you thought, okay, well, maybe many primates are very similar, but now we have a really big difference. And by the way, orangs have a very different energy expenditure, like a tenth or less of a fully active orang than a fully active human. Does that mean anything or not? I have no idea, but it begins making you sort of think, what could that mean? With a couple of the last projects. So just last month, we shared a cover article in Nature again on the gibbon genome, and that was the first publication we had with identification of a completely new kind of mobile element. Or next week, my wife will be presenting at ASHG on some joint work, identifying the first new mobile element in a North or South American, a New World monkey. And so, again, we have this sort of view. There are many different subfamilies, variations of these alus that had mutations that occurred relatively recently, just a few million years ago, or longer ago in evolutionary time. But that may look nicely structured, but of course the reality of doing these things is you plot things for the first time and I get a couple peaks, but I don't see the structure. And so with almost all the work that we've done up until really the last year or two, we spend a lot of time, as so many of you do, hacking in the code and massaging the code this way and that way and not really having the best interfaces. And we start seeing more structure, and with a lot of head banging and et cetera, we get something nice. But we're really working towards here also with the marmoset, which we published in Nature Genetics with many colleagues 2 months ago. We see tens of thousands of elements at any given point here. But we found just one or two out of those million that looked really different. They were labeled by the automated labeling engines as sort of ALU-like, but they were a lot shorter. They're 100 base pairs rather than 300. We at first assumed they're noise, and then we say, well, can we model those and look specifically for them? And rather than just 2, we find more like 2,000, and find, again, the substructures beneath that. And so finally, taking that and the Melody work, this is an earlier version of what we have in a more nice form now, but we're beginning to say, again, how can we fully begin realizing that dream of having a good argument around the data? With the other version, actually, we have some smartphones mixed into this. So it doesn't matter if you run out of tangibles, doesn't matter if you're in a different place, and trying to think, again, how would these kinds of tools impact both these large science projects, where with 1,000 genomes that Miriam's a part of, there are 700 scientists across more than 100 different institutions working really intensively together. And they do 98% of their work over the weekly telephone calls. Everyone load up the PowerPoint, and that has its strengths, but it definitely has its limitations. And so where could you go from there? And so one idea that we've had in different forms is looking again back to that counting table and saying, again, was that a useless artifact that we abandoned a few hundred years ago? Or can we think about taking spreadsheets into a more interactive physical form, where having tokens representing one or groups of genomes, different sorts of transformations, see people in that context? Here was an early prototype of aspects of that at supercomputing 2 years ago. We were navigating videos of Ed and other sorts of speakers as a sort of a generalization. Let's start with something that everyone can understand. There's another very different direction that I've become really excited about, and in my final slide or two, we'll show some examples how we've begun to sketch out in the last couple days. And that is that many of these genome projects run for 4 years, or 6 years, or 7 years, and there are fits and starts of very active activity, and then a year will pass where you're waiting for someone else to come up with the results. And I know that especially with LIGO and CERN, this is not something unique to this particular area. I think that, again, we've got, on the one hand, the time scale of seconds, minutes, hours of a session, and on another time scale, months, years, and decades. And how do we bridge these different time scales? We don't probably want to leave for a decade that 1 or 2 big screens on your desk at that data that may take a year to change. But can we look to architectural space? So we were about to build a new building. We had a 70-year-old dorm building that we were living in the whole time that Ed and Gab were at CCT. We said, can we begin reskinning that wall, lighting it on fire, giving it some kind of voice for some interesting kinds of data? Now, this was a very short-term project. I was given 2 opportunities. One, can you write an article in the next 2 months, but that has nothing to do with anything you've done the last 20 years? That was sort of interesting. My advisor later that evening said, Brygg, how do you want to be remembered when you die? I said, Hiroshi, I'm not yet 40. Can you give me a while to think about this? But we began thinking, how can we weave people into the walls? How can we weave the cloud into the walls? So then, as I do right now, I have 4 different buildings that I'm trying to orbit between, and it makes it really difficult for the students to find me and me to find the students. Well, if I put myself and the students up there on the wall, find some way, really horribly demonstrated here, but to show some color legend for Patrick Taylor Hall, Coates Hall, the Digital Media Center, and link that to Google Calendar so it knows at least where I'm supposed to have been 2 hours ago and 2 hours from now. But also begin lighting up with Skype and iChat and other sorts of expressions of me, so that as people are walking the halls, these spaces are somehow entangled. Can we entangle this building with the many, many other buildings on campus and the many, many other buildings off campus that work touches? On the top left is the cloud. So we have 21,000 commits in our SVN repository the last couple of years. We really try to get people, whether it's a grant or a paper or a code or whatever it is, I ask for at least a couple commits per workday from the students. Can we begin expressing that on the walls? Can we begin taking other content, some new, some rather older? So to me, the first machine, big resource when Ed and Gab arrived, SuperMic, I really think that machine deserves to be remembered 100 years from now. Now, there are different ways. So I loved in Siebel Hall seeing little kiosks for the different stages of iliac. But in a very much more emergent day, I have this email. It's around 2 a.m. on August 28th, 2005, where Brian Ropers-Holman was worried about losing his job because he was killing off these months-long running numerical relativity things for this crazy idea of having a hurricane queue. And the storm surge simulations that he did and that space he cleared off were one of several really important factors that for the first time in history led a governor of Louisiana to evacuate the city of New Orleans. And so I don't know how many hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of lives that machine and Ed and others' actions might have saved. But that was a really important inflection point, not just for Louisiana, but I think for this whole country. And not every supercomputer has that dramatic a particular impact, but I think everyone tells its particular story. And so here I've got 2 images left, and then we'll go to questions. This one is taking a classroom that Gab and Bob Koima helped establish, and say, if we make this into a teaching classroom, how can we put every class that's happened somehow associated with digital media? And put the name of every student on the wall. With a screen, that's sort of hard to put a couple thousand names on the wall. But here we've got 25 feet, why not do that? And what a lot of those students are really particularly motivated by is having a job someday. And so we're working to put all of the places those students have gone once they graduated. We have a lot at Google and Microsoft and Apple. Can they use a Connect to point at Microsoft or point at Google and see all the names light up and pictures of the projects and maybe even links into the SVN code that the students had? Or point to Professor Allen, point to me, point to someone else and see all the students light up, see all the different places, all the local places in Louisiana, all the other sorts of places, trying to maximally entangle instead of this playing card-sized mobile phone, which lets you go arbitrarily deep into one thing. How can we bask in all of these different kinds of things and make the right balance between dynamic real estate and static real estate? I think that if every surface, we surely could cover every surface with a dynamic screen. But I, at least, and I can't normalize for myself, but wouldn't be able to think anymore because my eyes are so drawn to motion, I wouldn't be able to see you, I'd just be torn off looking at the data. But if we can have many of the things that stay the same, the students that Gab had 15 years ago are still the students she had 15 years ago. That will never change. The spin students that you have now, those that were there, that's a past tense, that's a fact. And can you use that to do something sort of interesting? And so I hope this isn't offensive. But again, I've been so inspired to see what you've begun doing with your walls. Again, how can we light them on fire? How can we let them speak? And so I'm very confident at least half of you in the room are much better with a pen than I was. But at 2 a.m. a couple nights ago, I began saying, well, let's embed a couple screens, but let's begin projecting on the walls and the floors a little bit. Let's put up a couple little kiosks. And so as we walk by, I think that Ed this afternoon, as she walks back to the 4th floor, may be wanting to point to the 2nd stripe. He's really proud of, I think, the HIV results and how that exemplified blue water. So we'll projectively illuminate that panel, and we'll have a couple different pieces here. But especially then over towards the elevators, can we begin thinking about some mixture of a physical and visual representation? What is the physiology? What's the anatomy of the processors of blue waters, of the storage, of the network? The building itself, I understand, has a lot of heroics that went into making it viable to have a machine that insanely large. And so can we, again, projectively or with LEDs, begin illuminating those elements? And not just have that in this one location, but gosh, wouldn't it be nice to do something like this over in the Blue Waters building, or smaller scale additions, like the IKEA Billy cabinet you saw in the last version. Put that in many different small colleges, universities, and the NSF itself to, again, let people begin to experience in a way that celebrates not just what that is, but what it has been, what it could be. Think about new ways for physically embodying those supercomputing applications. So I see I'm at 43 minutes, was aiming for 45, I'll stop here. But I hope, again, these different examples and discussion have given you some new ways to think about what supercomputing applications can be, how they can be embodied today, tomorrow, 20 years from now, 40 years from now. And also, again, we've been trying to illustrate an approach where we dive deep into several different computational domains, but very much hope, following some of the fabulous successes at NCSA with Mosaic, Virtual Directory, and others, thinking how those generalize to touch many, many different lives. So there have been many hands and minds who've gone to make this possible, but I will thank all of you again and hope there are a couple moments for questions.
Okay, I hope we have some questions. We have a very dynamic range, large dynamic range of different topics mixed together here, and so I think there should be a lot of interesting discussion.
Hi, I'm Brock Angelo. So you talk a lot about the tangible, and then you mentioned some of the smartphone use. Could you maybe just give us your impressions of the significance of having something you can physically touch versus the touch screen? Because I think I do see a lot of the time that we kind of default to, well, let me just put it on a touch screen, but it seems to be a big emphasis for you that there's something you can physically control. And could you talk about that maybe?
Yes, so when I got my start in scientific computing at the Industrial Mathematics Initiative of the University of South Carolina, there was a gentleman named Bjorn Dahlberg who had this thing he expressed as the Christmas gift theory. When given the choice of A or B or C or D, say yes. And so rather than thinking about the tangibles as being the one true best way, we had a really great discussion with Donna and Bob about the virtual director. That sometimes using your whole body to give a performance and really help people understand all the dynamics, it's hard to do better. And then other times you're stuck in the cockpit of an airplane, and if you started trying to do this, you're swatting the woman to the left and the guy to the right, and you're not winning friends and influencing people. And so thinking how these ecologies of different kinds of devices, that to me, the more that I can weave some of those mass platforms into beginning to do something interesting. And maybe it's with the screen, though we had a great conversation with YT yesterday. I was trying to argue to Steve Brandt and others, wouldn't you like to use your smartphone to control YT? And the first answer was, maybe no. But the second answer is if we can start using its dynamics, wave it around, and then maybe do these other funny sorts of things, maybe that gives it a way to earn its keep. And so to me, I spend a lot of time sort of trying to not go into the smartphone and tablet space because that was sort of well understood. But then it felt somewhere between a lost opportunity and poor design, not to begin to think, how do those objects speak to what Donna and Bob and others are doing in the AVL? How do they, might a significant percentage of people end up using those to engage with at-scale computation? If you have an event at the Olympics with 1 billion eyeballs, can you imagine having a substantial fraction of those in some ways engaging? Some with these very widespread devices, and maybe use those to invite interaction and drive more special devices that they saw. They'd been doing that forever, but Donna had some amazing tangibles, and wow, can they 3D print that at their library and start to do that in the classroom in a way that the smartphone alone hadn't sustained. So that's only a fragment of an answer, but does that begin pointing to what you're asking? Super, thank you.
So this is a follow-up to that last question. So with tangible input, you could do it tangibly.
Yes.
Or you could run your finger over a piece of glass, which is what we do
yes.
a lot, to have exactly the same input. So in what circumstances, when is it better to do something tangibly rather than running your finger over a glass screen, particularly if you're a grown-up and a scientist? Because I think if you're doing it for kids, tangible always wins. But if we think about for adult scientists, when would they want to do tangible input rather than running their finger over a screen for input?
So I think there are a few Cricks and Watsons, perhaps, in this room, and others like this. And I think there's, again, a symbiosis. I don't and will never argue that tangible is always better. That's sort of I think my favorite motivational quote was actually written about 500 years ago in Gulliver's Travels about the sages of Legato. Does anyone remember the sages of Legato? Or a set of mathematicians who had this crazy idea to replace all words with things, which had only the small problem that as you go out into the world, you are like a peddler with having many people carrying all, and I've been that person too much. But here the argument is saying they're really focused on this thing. And of course, if they could have different displays, today we have relegated this entirely to the screen. It's so cheap, it's so convenient, and that's great. But if you're going to spend the $10 million, you're going to have 300 million people whose lives are going to be transformed by decisions you're having with their DNA. Can you think of some ways this building could be made out of cinder blocks, could be made with grass, some things, and yet we choose to invest to create a space that helps celebrate the importance of what's done. And so just as that's done for habitable space, why not with data space? In a land of big data, is there something that's possible? Never displace everything that can be done on glass. But I do think and believe and hope some of these examples give flavor of the possibility to have physical editions that complement, sometimes better, often less convenient, but live in the same ecology as those virtual editions. Professor Karahalios?
Hi, and thank you for the wonderful talk. If you would permit me, I have two sort of unrelated questions. The first one is a lot of your work seems to focus on lots of multimodal input. So you have lots of screens everywhere, lots of tangible interaction. And one thing I was wondering, I don't see voice very much, and maybe you've done so many projects, there's no way for you to describe all of them here today. But even with visualization, I can imagine saying, combining some of the hand input with some vocal input to get it some more nuanced.
Absolutely. I think it's a great question, and I'm probably influenced with my trajectory. My first two big science projects at the International Science and Engineering Fair were on speech recognition back in the late 80s. And I think that I've seen marvelous, again, I'm biased, again, but one of my favorite uses of multimodal interaction is one of the first versions of the virtual director, where people are speaking because both of their hands are busy doing some particular shape. I think that in this particular context, while my watch likes to listen to me, while many of you have devices, there are clearly many contexts where speaking is more challenging. And yet, I 100% agree that, to me, a mark of maturity of this research and practical space would be that some substantial subsets, and maybe in a decade or two, most of these devices also know about voice, just as they might wish to know about smartphones and other sorts of things. And so I do see that in some ways it may be a lost opportunity My team hasn't focused more on that to date. But I think we've just passed a tipping point, really, in the past handful of years, where there are ubiquitous devices that can really process that very reliably. And so if we can learn from earlier research examples like the virtual director, I agree with you that there's enormous potential there.
I mean, just as an aside from that, there's so many wonderful movies from the 80s showing concept videos of how something could be, and I feel like they've stopped happening recently. Like, I don't see as many concept movies as maybe we could make, and they help us think about why we want to do something.
Absolutely, and I think there are few places as well positioned as this center and this campus to, again, be churning those out, to expecting them of your students, of your SPIN students, that there should be at least one really wild, out-of-the-box video prototype something per semester.
And my second comment, which is just different, it's more of a comment than a question, but if you could address it, you know, touch screens in public spaces creep me out. There's lots of cafes in San Francisco where, you know, you touch something and there's just so much stickiness there, and
yes,
I cringe when I go to sit there. Even when I go to Microsoft, they have a bunch of these surfaces all over the place. It's almost as if they push me away.
Yep.
And so it would be really interesting to see research that, you know, where big screens and the interface of the screens rather attracts people rather than repels them.
I love that comment. And to me, my favorite two examples in some way, one is from the 1933 Chicago Century of Progress sort of exhibition where there was the Vinylite House. And there were two rooms where every aspect of floor, ceiling, wall, dish, whatever was in plastic. And the comment was that it was bright and colorful and interesting, but it struck people as very cold and maybe not a place they necessarily wanted to live. And so I think that much of the next 50 years and beyond will have the option of having arbitrary amounts of our surfaces covered by touch-sensitive display elements. But what is the balance? Let's take maybe the closest we've come, King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, where they've spent maybe hundreds of millions making vast arrays of these things. But 5 years later, they're sort of obsolete, and they're sort of wishing maybe they didn't have that. And so finding this right tension, balance between the possibility of ubiquitous multi-touch glass and leather and stone. And I think one thing I've loved coming back after 20 years is seeing how well some of the buildings have aged, like the Beckman Institute. And can we think about our interfaces to aspire to objects that want to be computational but to be used 20 and 200 years from now? It's sort of a fringe view, but I find it inspiring.
Hi, I'm Bob McGrath. I'm retired from NCSA now, but it's very, very interesting. There's lots of things I would like to argue with you about, but but one thing that I think would be an interesting thing for you to address is a lot of what we saw were basically single-user situations, and I'm very concerned with how we can make it better for people to talk face-to-face and work together face-to-face.
Absolutely.
And be human together face-to-face. And by the way, putting all that stuff on the wall, wrong idea from that point of view, because you're pulling everybody away to look at something that somebody else is saying rather than the person next to them that you'd like them to pay attention to. So one of the interesting things about tangibles is that they offer opportunities for things that we pay attention to together here now.
Absolutely.
So if you've got some interesting things to say on that, that'd be...
Absolutely. And I 100% agree that to me always, if I were picking two favorite examples of what tangibles could be when they grow up, A, it would relate to this interpersonal, intercultural exchange in single spaces and other spaces, and B, it could relate to the economic development of giving jobs to many millions and billions of people who are exquisite skills with their hands, are never going to outcode the Google or whatever engineer, but finding a way for that to express physical representations of social media, of Skype, of other sorts of things. And so to me, to the extent one could build spaces, structures that inspire people to want to come together, to use them, to be within them, that to me seems very important. And I agree that in the sort of birthing pains of too many of these things in too short timelines, too often too many of them have been single user and a little bit too graphically biased. But I 100% agree with the opportunity that you're celebrating and challenging a number of us You should ask Professor Karahalios for some of her discoveries in nursing homes relating to exactly that sort of thing, making something that was so good at doing something virtually that it decreased the very physical interaction they wanted to increase. And so I think you've given me in particular and all of us in general a really important challenge to live up towards.
Any last question? Donna, go ahead.
The University of Illinois is exploring the possibility of bringing together biology and engineering and a new medical school. Do you see potential applications here that you've worked on that would be applied to bioengineering and medicine?
Being married to a woman who was a practicing medical doctor for many years, if only for that reason, I would say absolutely. To me, one of the fascinating juxtapositions, and I don't know nearly enough, but if I think about some of the different collaborators the university presently has, collaborators at world-renowned places like the Mayo, and then the perspective of collaborations at the Carl, for instance, there are, I'm guessing, a very large number more medical places in the world that are similar to Carl than similar to the Mayo. In some sense, again, being at LSU, there are many more places in the world that are similar to LSU than similar to Urbana or to MIT. And so, especially with that view towards how is this going to touch every patient on the planet, I think that gives both challenges but some really amazing opportunities to say how within a relatively modestly sized facility in a relatively modestly populated community can we, over stages, over time, think about how to weave technologies into a world that we want to live in. Especially, to me, one of the biggest things I think about is having turned on to Lincoln to come over here. I think there's a very good chance that a few years from now, neither Lincoln, neither Roosevelt, Kennedy, many of our most effective presidents wouldn't have allowed to not only have office, but to be born. Because so many of the highly impactful people had medical issues that were serious. And so running this line of tension between trying to heal but not trying to hurt, and to realize it's not just your genome, but it's your grandchildren and your grandparents' genome as well. And I think there's so many more questions than answers, but I think that it sounds like the campus and the Carl and the Mayo are coming into a really beautifully positioned way to, in a very rich ecology, address and engage some of those questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Brygg. Really exciting talk. Thank you.